We're looking at Joseph's early life. Many of us will know the story of Joseph from stage plays such as Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. Who was Joseph in the play at school? No one, yeah. Gosh, what are the chances of that? Or from one of the songs such as Any Dream Will Do. That will be it for this morning, don't worry. Maybe it's from Graham Norton's BBC show, Any Dream Will Do, where they tried to find a lead singer for the stage show. Or the DreamWorks movie, King of Dreams. Who's seen that one? Yeah, bro, just two people again, surely. Well, I enjoy my cartoons, so maybe I'm still a man. There you go. Anyway, it's a story full of drama, intrigue, lies, slavery, deception. It's got enough in it to model to challenge any of our modern day soaps, such as EastEnders or Corrie. And at the center of the story, is this young man, Joseph. So we're going to read chapter 37. It's a long chapter, so I'm going to read parts of it and summarize other parts. Do follow with me. We're going to pick it up in the second part of verse 2. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them, his brothers, to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all his other brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. And the story unfolds that Joseph's brothers were sent off to pasture the sheep some distance away. And because probably he was the favored one, he got to stay at home with dad. And one day his father wants a report of how the brothers are going on with the sheep. So he sends Joseph off to go and find them. So off he goes, probably wearing his fancy new coat. And we pick the story up in verse 18. They saw him, the brothers saw Joseph from afar. Before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." So they grab the young brother Joseph, and they don't end up actually killing him. They throw him into a pit, and some slave traders are passing by. Instead of killing him, they sell him to the slave traders. And the chapter ends with verse 36, where it says this: "Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard." On the surface, this is the story of a man, a very normal man, his journey through life, his dreams, his hopes, his aspirations, his successes, his failures, his highs and his lows. But it is not simply the story of a man, is it? It's actually just as much, if not more so, really, the story of God. Or as Terry Virgo puts it, it's an account of God's great dealings wrapped up in the life and story of a man. So the account of God's great dealings wrapped up in the life and the story of a man, that man Joseph. Just to say at the outset, over the years I've listened to a lot of Terry Virgo's preaching and teaching on this, and so his influence will inevitably come through this morning. But there's two things I want to look at this morning. Number one, the man, Joseph, and how he handles his dream, and the fact that he is chosen by God. Secondly, the making of the man, the beginnings of Joseph's journey to maturity, and in that we learn of the sovereignty of God. So firstly, the man. Now when we look at the early years of Joseph's life, it's very hard to get an impartial view, isn't it? Because we know how the story ends. We know that the boy wins through, don't we? He maintains his integrity later in life and his purity under intense pressure, but he comes through. So the storyline is already told for us. But at age 17, in chapter 37, Joseph is far from the finished product that we find in chapter 50 as the prime minister on Egypt. So what is he really like? This young boy of 17, what's he really like? Well, I think he is a bit of a dreamer, even before he has the dreams. He is his father's favored son, and he gets this fancy coat that's been immortalized as a Technicolor dream coat by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. Now, the coat, some commentators suggest, was far more than just a sign of his father's favor. It was actually a sign that the birthright had been given to Joseph. Now, that was a huge thing in those days. The birthright, the family inheritance, or at least most of it, would normally go to the oldest son. But we're told in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 that Reuben, who was the oldest son, had disqualified himself. And instead of giving it to the second oldest or the third oldest, Jacob actually gives the birthright to Joseph, his favored son. And so I suspect, even before he has these dreams, the boy has got thoughts of grandeur. Here he is, the favored son with a fancy coat and the birthright. Now, I remember when I was made a prefect at my school in Zimbabwe, it was quite a big thing. Let's say I changed somewhat the moment I became a prefect. We all know it. Someone gets promoted at work or someone becomes a prefect. They change, don't they? They get high thoughts of themselves very quickly. I think that's what's going on with Joseph. He's got thoughts of grandeur, high on self-confidence because he's favored and he's been given the birthright. And then he has the dreams, doesn't he? Not one, but just two. And he runs to his brothers and he says, "Behold, I've had a dream. I've dreamed a dream." And he goes on to tell them, "I've had a dream where I rise above you, dear brothers, and you bow down and you worship me and you serve me." So the big question really is, why does Joseph rush and tell his brothers? I wonder if you've ever thought that. Why does Joseph rush and tell his brothers about this dream? Particularly when the meaning of the dream is pretty clear, isn't it? It doesn't take his brothers long to figure it out. And secondly, when there's this tension already between Joseph and his brothers. Surely he knew that it would just create more tension and stoke the coals of hatred. So why did he do it? Was it naivety or youthful exuberance perhaps? I've had a dream. Was it innocent? Or more likely, I think, was it out of arrogance and one-upmanship? Was it out of arrogance and one-upmanship? He knew he was going to stir the fires of hatred in his brothers. I think Joseph rushes to tell his brothers because he cannot wait for these dreams to come true. He cannot wait for the day that his brothers bow before him. Because I think his brothers, who can be a pretty rough piece of work, I reckon they've been bullying him and teasing him. Remember the teacher's pet at school? How we used to tease them and bully them? Or maybe you were the teacher's pet. I was for parts of my life, and you get picked on, don't you? So I reckon his brothers have been giving him a pretty hard time, and then he has these dreams and he thinks, right, this is how it works out. And so he rushes to tell them. He cannot wait for the dream to come true. But the boy has no idea, does he, how long it will take or how hard the journey will be for the dream to come true. Joseph is in a rush for the promises of God on his life to come to fruition. Learning to wait for God to bring about his promises is a hard lesson to learn, isn't it? Learning to wait for God is a very hard lesson to learn in life. Joseph would have done well to heed the warning of Proverbs 19 verse 2, where it says, "It's not good to have zeal without knowledge, nor to be hasty and miss the way." It says that in the NIV. If you've got the ESV, it might say it's not good to have desire without knowledge. It's not good to have zeal without knowledge. The boy, Joseph, is certainly zealous. He's certainly hasty, as young men are prone to be. He's living with this dream, this promise of God over his life, and he wants it to happen now. He wants it to happen tomorrow. One of the things I find fascinating about Genesis chapter 37 is it is absolutely silent on Joseph giving up any resistance to wearing the coat or to staying at home while his brothers worked. Did you notice that? His brothers were sent to work, he stayed at home, he's given this fancy coat, and wearing it would have made the situation worse. But we don't read anything about Joseph saying, "No, Dad, I don't want to wear this coat," or "No, I want to go and work with my brothers." No, Joseph doesn't put up any resistance, because I think what's going on in his mind is, this is what God has in store for me. God's promised me that I'll one day rule and reign over my brothers. Might as well start now. I might as well wear this coat and show everyone what's inevitably going to happen. I might as well not go and work with them. I'm going to rule over them. Should I go and work with them? Joseph is in danger of trying to bring about God's plans for his life before God is ready to bring them to fullness. Learning to wait for God to bring about his promises in his time, using his methods, is a very hard lesson to learn. Joseph's family have got this wrong for generations. Abraham and Sarah, generations before, were promised a son by God. But after years of barrenness, Sarah says, Abraham, why don't you have a son with Hagar, my servant? And so he does, and Ishmael's born, and that only ends in heartache and pain because that wasn't God's plan. They short-circuited God's plan. And the same happened with Jacob, Joseph's father. He wanted children with his favorite wife, Rachel, but after years of barrenness, she said, why don't you have a child with my servant Bilhah? And so they had a child. But when Joseph came along, that was God's plan. Joseph's family have a record, a history of shortcutting God's plans for their life. Joseph is in danger of making the same mistake, shortcutting God's plans for his life. Maybe you're in the same place here today, full of dreams, promises of God over your life. Maybe you feel God's called you to preach. Maybe you feel God's called you to be a cell leader. Maybe God's called you to be in the worship band, and you feel you've got these promises. Maybe you feel God's called you outside of the church to have influence, for example, in the music industry or in the arts world. You've got these promises of God. Maybe you're not married yet, and you believe God's got a husband or a wife waiting for you, and you want to wake up and live the dream tomorrow. You want it to happen now. Well, to avoid the mistakes that Joseph made, it's important to heed the warnings of Proverbs 19, verse 2. It's not good to have zeal without knowledge of how God works. And if nothing else, the story of Joseph teaches us that God works out his promises over a much longer period of time than we would care for him to take. He works out his promises by taking a lot longer to work on us, the people he gives promises, than we care to think that actually he needs to do. Maybe actually you're in a different place. There was a time when you were full of dreams. You had plans. You felt called by God. You were passionate about certain things. But when you look back, actually, you feel maybe I took a few wrong turns. Maybe you're a bit like Joseph, being hasty. I know I've made that mistake in my life. And you think maybe I've disqualified myself because of the way I've handled my dreams. Well, if that's you this morning, the life of Joseph is a great encouragement because although Joseph makes mistakes, we know it's not the end of the story for him, don't we? We know it's not the end of the story for him because of this one overriding fact. The promises of God on his life will come about because God has chosen him. God has chosen Joseph, and God will have his purposes brought about. God will have his man at the end of the day. It's a human story, yes, and Joseph is at the center of it, but it's also the story of a God who chooses people to be his children and to bring about his purposes. God gave Joseph the dreams. God chose Joseph. Just as a generation before, he chose Jacob, his father. If you know anything about Jacob, he was a man who was far from perfect. In fact, he was flawed and yet chosen. We've preached on that recently in this truth. And this fundamental truth that God chooses people to be his children and to work out his purposes is fundamental for the Christian to grasp. It is the bedrock for the Christian of peace, of joy. It is the bedrock of our relationship with God and of our security. The Bible is full of explicit times where it says God chooses people to be his children. Ephesians 1 verse 4 is just one of the places we could go. It says God chose us in him before the foundation of the world. Knowing God has chosen you, dear friends, causes you to sail steady through life. You're not up one day when you're doing well, low when you mess up. No, God's affection is on you. It is fixed on you, and it's based on him and his choice. So when we pray 5 times a day, it's not that he has chosen us more. No. We're not up and down. It's not based, his choice in us, on our spiritual goals being reached. It's not based, and it doesn't disappear when we get things wrong. And so when we slip up like Joseph did, it's not the end of the stories. Our frailties don't take God by surprise, do they? God's affection for us is much more determined and resolute than we can ever imagine. So if you've made mistakes and not handled your dreams so well, maybe you feel a bit disqualified, take encouragement. God's affection and his plans for your life are much more determined than we could ever imagine. And maybe you're here this morning, you're supporting those who are being baptized. You would say you're not a Christian. Actually, you'd say, I'm not really a Christian. How does this apply to me? How can I become God's child? How do I know if I'm chosen? Well, the Bible says that today is the day of salvation. If you're asking those questions, the Bible's message is that today, before you even leave today, actually you can become a child of God. If you accept that Christ has taken away these mistakes that we all made, and maybe you relate more to Joseph, who actually was quite a good bloke, wasn't he? When you consider the other Old Testament characters, Joseph did quite well. He made some mistakes. Maybe you relate more to his brothers. Yeah, they made some significant mistakes. Wherever you fall on the spectrum of goodness, what's needed is to accept that Jesus on the cross has paid for those mistakes so that your relationship with God can be restored. It's not the end of the story just because we make mistakes. And when we look at the life of Joseph, we learn that. Because in Genesis 37, he is far from the finished product that we find in Genesis 50. He's a diamond geezer in the rough, as R.T. Kendall put it. He didn't put the geezer in, I did. But we also see in the story of the man Joseph, we see the story of a God who chooses people. But as we'll unfold in the coming weeks, we also read about the making of the man, how God takes this man and he molds and shapes him for his purposes. So secondly, this morning, the making of the man. Towards the end of chapter 37, we don't see Joseph in a palace with his brothers bowing down before him, do we? We see Joseph in a pit, and then we see Joseph being led off to slavery. And maybe you feel something like that, not at the pinnacle of youth, but actually far from the place 10 or 20 or even 5 years ago, far from the idea of what you thought life would look like now. Maybe you feel your dreams have been dashed, maybe disillusioned or disappointed with how things have been worked out. Well, however disillusioned Joseph might have felt, however disillusioned the dreamer might have felt, the dream giver was still at work behind the scenes, wasn't he? Making ready his man. God is laying the foundations. He's got his man, and now he must get it ready. And so begins Joseph's journey to Egypt. On the surface, it seems that Joseph is a plaything of fortune, doesn't it? From a human level, it seems that the life of Joseph is tossed up and down by the wind and the waves of fortune. One day pasturing his sheep, the next day favored by his father and given the birthright, the next day put in a pit by his brothers and sold into slavery, the next day raising profile in Potiphar's house, the next day accused of adultery, thrown into prison, and then the next day the prime minister of Egypt. It can feel like, from a human level, Joseph's story is one that he is a plaything of fortune. And we too, our lives can feel the same, can't they? That we are tossed about to and fro by our circumstances. Life can feel like we're at the mercy of the wind and waves of fortune. Joseph's life was like that, full of peaks, full of troughs, at the mercy of his brothers, at the mercy of Egyptian rulers. But ultimately, friends, he was never at the mercy of any of those factors. He was in the hands of a sovereign God. God has got his man, hasn't he? And he is shaping him and forming him and crafting him, positioning him to bring about his purposes. And it's not always easy when God does that, is it? Even when God's absent, it can be hard. Many of us would have heard that Pfizer, a big pharmaceutical industrial hub in the area, is going to be closing down at the end of next year. That will have a huge impact on us as a church. 40% of our local population are employed in the public sector, as compared to 21% nationally. And in the next couple of years, it's estimated that at least 500,000 public sector jobs will be lost. It's a huge impact on us. And individuals personally, it's a huge impact on us. The question is, when that happens, are we at the mercy of closures of company? Are we at the mercy of these events? Or are we in the hands of a sovereign God who is bringing about his purposes? Are we not in the hands of a God, we're told in Romans 8:28, works all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose? We serve a God, do we not, who is not distant and uninvolved, but a God rather who is active and uninvolved. Not a God who is aloof, but a God who has sent his very own son into the bump and grind of life so that he can sympathize with us even when we feel tossed by the waves. What we learn about the life of Joseph is that actually God is sovereign. And when we're speaking about God's sovereignty, we're speaking about his rule and his reign throughout the world. Tom last week spoke about the providence of God, basically the same thing. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this theme will emerge again and again throughout the story of Joseph, because we live in times that are very turbulent, aren't we? We live in times where economically things are very fragile, security concerns with the threat of terrorism, weather getting more extreme. You hear stories around the world of flooding, particularly we've just seen in Australia. We live in times where all these insecurities could be overwhelming unless you know that God is sovereign. The sovereignty of God is something that later in life Joseph has come to not just think is true, not just feel is true, but it's something that has become so real to him that when he's face to face with his brothers, we can read this in Genesis 50, verse 20. When he's face to face with his brothers who have hated him, who have deceived his father and broken his heart, who have thrown him in the pit, he's not embittered, is he? He says this in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Now we can pass over that verse, but imagine what it was like for Joseph. Years after being hated by his brothers, he didn't look at them and say, "You nasty piece of work." He says, actually, in the whole story, I see the hands of a sovereign God at work. The making of the man Joseph is as much a story about a sovereign God who rules and reigns over every detail of your life. Is your God like that? Can you believe that God is interested in every little detail of your lives? When we read the story of Joseph, and we can't escape but actually be reminded about Jesus, can we? Jesus followed a similar path to Joseph. He, at a young age, knew the purposes of God for his life. He was rejected by those close to him, his family, his religious leaders of the time. He was certainly ill-treated by the Roman authorities. He certainly meant evil against him, beating him, mocking him, and putting him to death, a plaything of injustice. But God, the great theme of the Bible, but God. But God meant it for good. The whole suffering and the death of Jesus. But God meant it that many would be saved, not from a physical starvation, but actually from a spiritual starvation. Jesus says in John 6:35, he says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger." Just before that, he says, "The bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." I am the bread of life, Jesus said. Maybe you're not a Christian and you've got to the point in your life where you've realize that there's something more to this life. You think life is about more than 60 years and that's the end of it. Maybe you've seen the miracle of the birth of a child. My wife's pregnant. More than anything else, apart from my faith, the miracle of the birth of a child blows my mind to the point where I just cannot accept that that is the product of random events bringing it about. Maybe you've seen masses of things happening in nature and you realize we're just the right distance from the sun. We're all held together by something more than chance. By actually the sovereign of God. Maybe it's simply, if you're not a Christian, that you've got a hunger and a stirring. There's more to life than this. There's a greater meaning. Jesus is the greater Joseph, isn't he? Jesus is the one who went through more suffering and more injustice than Joseph did, that he would bring life and that we would know actually a relationship with a sovereign God that is not one of fear and not one of running away, but actually one of intimacy, that we could call God Father. And yes, we would bow before him in awe, but actually know a relationship with him. These two things were learned amongst many others from the early life of Joseph. He handled his dreams wrong, but ultimately he was chosen by God. And the making of him is a story of God's sovereignty. In a moment, we're going to hear stories of those getting baptized and how they have come to know this Jesus. Their journey in finding there's a hunger in their lives and finding that Jesus is the only one who truly is satisfied. He is the bread of life. But I'd love to pray for us quickly before we come to an end. At the end of the service, we'll go through for baptisms, but there will be a ministry team, those in red t-shirts, who would love to talk with you and pray with you. If you're not a Christian and you want to ask questions, I would love to chat with you this morning. Maybe you're feeling the pressures of job loss or economic downturn, or even feeling wholly intimidating by this whole Pfizer situation. I would love to pray with you afterwards. But if you'll join me now, we'll just pray and then hear the great stories of those who have come to know Jesus. Father, we thank you for the story of Joseph. We thank you. It's a story of a God who chooses people independent of their goodness or their badness and wholly dependent on his sovereign will. Thank you. It teaches us the story of a God who upholds us in his hand, even when we're in the pits. We ask for your grace and your help for those of us who feel somewhat like Joseph at the end of the chapter, that you would uphold us even in the pits. And for those of us with dreams and desires, give us grace to know your purposes and your outworking. Give us patience, I pray. For young men and women in the room or those young in dreams, give patience and grace to come through and to know you in the midst of great trial. And for those who don't know you, wouldn't say we're Christians, Lord, I pray that you would speak to them this morning and reveal yourself. Amen.